Good evening and welcome to 2020 Vision, which this evening is going to have an international focus. We are looking at what's going on in Palestine, but bringing it right back to the UK as well, because this week is a week of action and we are leading up to a day of action on Saturday, and we're going to find out what local campaigners are going to be doing. It's an important topic, and we will say let's not lose sight of it, and so indeed, let's not lose sight of it. So straight away, let's introduce our guest, Sybil, Sybil Cock from the East London Palestine Solidarity Campaign, who's been a guest before. Welcome back, Sybil. Nice to see you back again. So, and it's always the case that when there's something going wrong with my system, I think that when people start to speak, I can't actually hear them, but hopefully that'll wear off, and everyone else is hearing you, and I'll hear you shortly. That's usually what happens. But for the moment, we're looking at three particular aspects of the campaign, of the three parts of the slogan that the campaign is concentrating on this week: Stop Annexation, End Apartheid, and Sanctions Now, which you can see on your screen. If you'd like to join us, dear viewer, you can phone straight into the studio. That's on 0208 12345 07. So let's kick off then. Thanks for joining us, Sybil. And let's begin. Stop Annexation. That's the first part of the day of action. Can you just remind the viewers what is being annexed and why should it stop?
Thank you. Right. That's probably the most complicated one to explain. The President Trump basically gave the Israelis a green card to go ahead and annex. I'm going
to ask you to pause for a moment, Sybil, because I can't actually hear you, which is unfortunate. Let's hope everybody else can. Oh, yes, my screen is doing something different. Let's try again. I think you're coming on now. Hello, Sybil, can you?
Yeah, okay.
Now I can hear you. That's a little glitch that we seem to have. Yeah.
So this is largely about President Trump and the legacy of President Trump. So Trump essentially earlier this year allowed the Israelis to go ahead with de jure annexation, that means in law annexation of vast swathes of the West Bank. And that we had protests around that in the summer. There's been a little bit of standing back from that even before the American election, partly because the other thing that's going on at the same time is that a number of the Arab nations are beginning to normalize their relationships with Israel. So far, we've had Bahrain, the UAE, and Sudan. And the big talk is about Saudi Arabia normalising. Now, if those countries all normalise with Israel, then they're basically throwing the Palestinians under the bus. So that's it's an alternative way of looking at it. The other thing about annexation is that in practice, there is what you call a de facto annexation, because certainly as far as the West Bank is concerned and East Jerusalem, basically the Israelis completely control it anyway, and they're constantly expanding building of settlements means that in practice what they're doing is they're just grabbing more and more land. They've been doing that for decades, but it has escalated massively in the last year, actually, particularly since Trump has been so open about supporting Netanyahu. So,
sorry, would you say that that escalation and the speed of annexation is something driven by the USA, or is it to do with politics domestically in the Israeli state?
It's both. It's both. I mean, so basically, Trump has allowed Netanyahu to do this additional building of settlements. Now, Israeli settlements are all illegal under international law. So every single settlement is a crime against international law. But and during the whole long years of the so-called peace process, what was happening was that while the people were talking in various forums, particularly brokered by the Americans, while the people were talking, basically the Israelis were building bigger and bigger and more settlements. So it's a kind of a bit of both. What the Israelis want, and in this I would include not just Netanyahu's extreme right-wing party, but actually all of the mainstream parties, in fact, all the parties except for the Arab parties in Israel, are in favour of expanding Israel into what we know as the West Bank.
Good
and
heavens.
what they call Judea and Samaria.
Good heavens. So, I mean, this is what I was going to ask. So, you spoke about annexation and settlements. I'm a bit confused now. Why do we say stop annexation? Is annexation the same as settlements, or
it's not the same? So annexation was the initiative that Trump endorsed in the earlier part of this year. So he said Israel is going to annex huge chunks of, and annexation is means that basically you're taking the land. You're no longer militarily occupying. You're just saying it's ours now. It's ours.
Yeah.
Go away. In the same way as they annexed East Jerusalem in 1967, and also the Golan Heights, which belong to Syria.
Yeah. So annexation of a piece of land brings it directly under the legal system of the state of Israel, and therefore it's easier to build settlements.
It will be easier to build settlements, although to be honest, it hasn't. The fact that it's not annexed hasn't really stopped them. I mean, it's a very fine dividing line. But this idea of annexation is something that got a lot of international publicity because Trump was seen as flying in the face of international law by encouraging it.
He's flying off somewhere else now, isn't he? Is there any hope that Biden might reverse that policy?
Unfortunately, the answer is probably not. It will change because Biden is a much more of an internationalist. So Trump's only international interest really has been in Iran, and the whole nuclear deal, and also in supporting Israel. Biden is much more of an internationalist, but he has just named his new Secretary of State, a guy called, whose name I've forgotten, it doesn't really matter, nobody's heard of him yet. But the Secretary of State, who's basically the chap that does foreign affairs stuff, and he and Biden are both dyed-in-the-wool friends of Israel. And they have both said, so Biden said, as long ago as 1986, Biden said, Israel is the best $3 billion investment we can make, right? And Biden has welcomed the normalization between these Arab states and Israel. So there isn't much chance of a change. However, it's likely that Biden will go back to encouraging bilateral talks. Now, the bilateral talks between Israel and Palestine, brokered by the Americans, have been non-existent for a whole number of years, certainly all of the Trump years. So it's likely that Biden will say, let's come back to the talking shop. But that's about the best you could expect, I think.
Well, this is sort of going slightly a bit further off, just talking about annexation. But I'm wondering why the Arab states have made this change in position. You're saying they're sort of moving towards normalizing relations with Israel, which must mean dropping a lot of demands. I mean, was Trump bugging him a few bob, or what was he about?
It's to do with, well, I mean, first of all, you have to look at the nature of these states. I mean, the Saudi state is absolutely, and Bahrain as well in particular, utterly brutal. And, they lock people up, they execute people, they chop their hands, the most revolting place. It's also a major part of the international arms trade. So there are campaigns to stop arming Israel. There are also campaigns to stop arming Saudi Arabia. And Saudi Arabia, of course, waging a horrific war in Yemen at the moment, partly with British arms. So while they're doing it, they see the business opportunities. So basically, they want to have deals with Israel because Israel is a major, but it's it's an economic player in the Middle East. And the other thing is, of course, that they want to form an alliance against Iran. And so Trump's saber rattling, if you like, against Iran and the withdrawal from the deal is something which those states also endorse. And so what I think they're doing is they're creating a bulwark against Iran.
Mm-hmm. It does make sense. It's a complex area, and as you say,
that's sort of my take on it. I think
that's fine. It's nice to hear something put as clearly as you've put that, and obviously, we're talking about some states that are dictatorships and or are, as you say, enforce their positions. The leaderships enforce their positions by very brutal methods. And of course, we must sort of say in passing that there's a great deal of brutality in many of the other states of the world as well. They are not unique in that. So one last question on annexation, which may seem silly, but let's sort of get the basics sorted. Why does the Israeli state want to build more settlements? Is it just pressure of numbers, or is it a sort of physical manifestation of a political desire? Does it actually show that it's conquered the land, or how does that all work out?
It's an interesting way of putting it, because actually it's a bit of both. There are certainly population pressures, enormous population pressures, and I think the latest statistics I found indicate that there are almost equal numbers of Israeli Jews and Palestinians in the land of in the country, which is Israel, the West Bank, Jerusalem and Gaza, which effectively is one country. It's one territorial entity because it's all dominated by Israel. So there is certainly, and Israel is quite a crowded little country. So there is certainly part of it is that. But the other part of it, probably more significant, is that the Israelis have always, they have always coveted and wanted the whole of what they call Judea and Samaria, which is what we now know as the West Bank. They've always wanted it, and there is an arrangement whereby any Jewish person in the whole world can go to Israel and settle there, and get an Israeli passport and get citizenship and get all the rights that Israelis have that Palestinians don't. But Palestinians don't have the right to go back to the lands they were driven out of in 48 or 67. And part of it is actually quite ideological as well, because Mike Pompeo, who is Trump's Secretary of State, is what's called a Christian Zionist, and these are extreme evangelicals, and they're Christians. They're not Jewish. They're Christian Zionists, and they believe that the second coming is not going to happen. All the Jews are gathered in Judea and Samaria or something. I mean, a lot of it is completely off the wall. So he will be actively encouraging the return from the Jewish diaspora of people to the land of Palestine. It's hard if you look up Christian Zionists. I mean, they are utterly a bit bonkers. So he sees defending Israel as a divine mission. So a lot of what Israel rests on is stuff that is written in the Bible, and Pompeo is part of that, although he's not Jewish.
How very strange that a man was. It's almost like it's almost like putting climate deniers in charge of ecological policy. But then again, I think Trump's probably done that as well. So it's consistent. Yeah.
They're quite, it's quite a big movement in the States.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. And I will say in passing as well that obviously there's historic persecution of Jewish people, which does lead in many cases to a desire to have and defend, even if they don't use, the right to go to a country where they can feel safe from all those who've persecuted them historically. So there is a genuine and well-founded fear of persecution in many Jewish people. And I think what we're talking about is not trying to belittle that in any way, so much as looking at the expense, looking at the cost of realizing that, and it's sort of passing on that persecution to other people in an unacceptable way. So we need to find something that will work on that. So okay, is it that when we talk about the Israeli state, we often talk about the apartheid state, which can be a controversial term because that term was applied to South Africa as a state which operated its democracy on the basis of what colour people were and defined people very biologically by the colour of their skin. How is it then that we now apply that term apartheid to the Israeli state and what's going on there? What does it actually mean in the state of Israel?
That's a very important question, and as you can see, we are foregrounding that narrative of Israel as apartheid quite a lot in our campaigning these days. So just before the show, I looked up one of the, I think it's the United Nations definition of apartheid. Now, apartheid is defined as inhuman acts committed for the purpose of establishing and maintaining domination by one racial group over another and the systematic oppression of the second racial group. So that describes apartheid in South Africa, but it also actually describes apartheid in Israel. There are obviously key differences. And if you like, the biggest difference is that the South African state, and of course I'm old enough to remember campaigning against that apartheid as well, the South African state needed its black workers. So there was a different relationship between the majority of black people and the minority of white people. Whereas in Israel, they are equally balanced in terms of the size of population in that sort of greater Israel, what we would call Palestine area. So 6.45 million Jewish Israelis and 6.41 million Palestinians. So that's very, very close. And the systematic oppression of, so Palestinians, whether they are in Gaza, which is one story, East Jerusalem, which is another story, or the West Bank, which is the third story and the biggest population, are treated differently in almost every respect. They have no freedom of movement. People cannot leave Gaza, even quite often for medical treatment. Education systems are completely separate, and even within so 20% of the population of Israel itself are Palestinians, and the funding given to their education is vastly less than the funding to the Jewish education system. Similarly with housing, and actually when you go to, I have been inside Israel a little bit, and when you go, it is very obvious that there is very distinct segregation going on. There are Palestinian towns, Palestinian areas, which are the poorer ones, and there are Israeli ones into which Palestinians are not allowed. That's within Israel. Within the West Bank, which of course is the bit I know best, and East Jerusalem, it's also extremely obvious. So in East Jerusalem, which is largely Arab, there are settlers even inside the old city of Jerusalem who basically take over old buildings, kick out the Palestinians who lived there, because if you're a Palestinian citizen in East Jerusalem, you can't leave your home for more than 18 hours without risking it being taken over by settlers. And a lot of these settlers are funded by American foundations and so on. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So also settlers in the West Bank, the settlers that live in the settlements in the West Bank are subject to Israeli civil law. So that's one sense in which annexation isn't going to change a huge amount, because they're already treated as citizens of Israel. They have a vote, they can do everything they want. The Palestinians who live in the West Bank are under Israeli military law, and they're under military occupation. So an incredibly different situation. Many other things. By the way, I got most of this, I just looked it up to refresh my memory. I got most of this information actually from War on Want, which, as you know, is a charity which seeks to relieve poverty and deprivation around the world. And they have a bit that isn't charitable, but they campaign very heavily around this. So the forcible transfer of population, that's another thing that the South African apartheid regime did, was it just moved people around. So if a group of settlers spots a piece of land that they like the look of, probably because it's on an aquifer, it's got lush water, or it's very fertile, or whatever, what they do is they just remove the Palestinians who are already living there. And it's interesting that the figures on house demolitions for this year, I mean, they have absolutely massively escalated. There was a case, I think, last month where a whole village was demolished. And I think it was 74 individuals were made homeless. I mean, we're talking bulldozers here. Were completely made homeless and were and something like 80 structures. So that would be houses, schools, mosques, but also importantly animal shelters and wells and things like that. So it is something which, under cover partly of COVID, and I know we're going to go back to that, partly under cover of COVID, and largely under cover of Trump, they are escalating. It's the biggest number of house demolitions for 10 years. So that's, that kind of fits within the narrative of apartheid. Then another thing is that Palestinians have no right to return to their original lands if they're 48 lands or 67 lands, or even places they were thrown off last week. They have absolutely no right to go back there. And then, of course, a corollary of the Israeli military law is that there are constant arrests of Palestinians. I mean, seriously large numbers, including large numbers of children who are arrested. The Israelis have, under military law, they have a system called administrative detention. So they can basically arrest someone and bang them up for 6 months without a reason, without having to give a reason or appear before a court. After 6 months, they have to produce a reason. And what they quite often do is they release the person, and then 10 hours later they rearrest them and give them another 6 months administrative detention. So the legal system is completely different.
It's fascinating to listen to this. I'm just going to thank Mr. Kunwar for leaving a message on our Facebook comments. But unfortunately, the link that you've pasted in there, Ali, is got cut off, and not the whole link is there, and therefore that link is not going anywhere. So if you'd like to repost that link, viewers will be able to follow it and have a look at what you're recommending. And if you want to tell us about it, then you can phone in. You know the number, I'm sure. I can't. I've forgotten it. I used to know. There we are. 020 0208 123 4507. So give us a call, Ali, and tell us about what it is you wanted to share with us. But it is interesting to hear the apartheid, the description of why the word apartheid is being used. So I've got two questions there, really, Sybil. One is, I remember the word apartheid being tentatively put forward as a useful word probably 20 years ago. I mean, is it actually a word that's more commonly used now in this kind of discussion, or is it still something that only a few campaigners are putting forward? I mean, I think that's the main sort of
question. I mean, that's a good question. I think it is becoming used more widely, and there have been a number of quite academic studies and United Nations reports which have really underlined in quite a forensic sort of way as I said before, they're not the same, but the two situations are obviously different, but what they have in common is that they are settler colonial. So it is one group settling in a colonialist way, settling the land of another group.
Well, I think this is very good. So yes, sorry.
Yeah, so that's
finish it. Yeah, I mean, so we've described why what is so pernicious about annexation and why we need to stop that. We've looked at apartheid as a very useful description of the Israeli state. So I think we can understand why this week's Day of Action is organised around those two demands, and we need to move on and look at how we actually. What campaigning tactics we use to try to bring about those two demands, stop annexation and end apartheid. And the answer to that is sanctions now.
Yes.
So sanctions, is that really enough? I mean, I do remember, I've said it before, but I remember an old friend of mine called Tony who used to say, I've never bought a South African orange in my life and apartheid hasn't ended. In fact, it's never on to end. But really, sanctions, is it just down to us which oranges we buy?
No, I mean, not buying South African oranges was never part of the sanctions, really. That was the sanctions thing is it's boycott, divest, and sanctions. So BDS is the term that we use, and this is a term which is coined by Palestinians, the Boycott, Divest, and Sanctions National Committee. So they're not buying South African or Israeli oranges is the individual boycott. But also the boycott, for example, would be boycotting the Eurovision Song Contest when it was in Tel Aviv last year.
Oh, right,
So there's a whole thing about the cultural boycott and the academic boycott, if you like. So there are all sorts of campaigns going on about Israeli artists and Israeli theatre groups. And what we're not saying we're not going to watch them because they're Israeli. What we're saying is we're not going to watch them because they are supported by the Israeli state. And there's a whole number of arguments around, which I'm not terribly familiar with, around universities and academic cooperation. So that's the boycott. Divestment is actually also very important. I'll come to sanctions in a minute, but divestment is important because, and it's actually particularly important at the moment because the Palestine Solidarity Campaign won a astonishing victory in the Supreme Court earlier this year, which means that we are able legally to campaign for local authorities to divest their pension funds from complicit companies. Now, there's a whole load of stuff about this on the PSC website, and I won't say too much about it, but there is a growing movement for people in receipt of local authority pensions. Well, I'm not, because I have a teacher's pension, but many, many people are. To actually write to their council pensions committee, and we've done this in Tower Hamlets, say, look, do you realise that you might be investing in all these dreadful firms? So JCB, for example, whose diggers demolish villages, and Caterpillar, and so on and so on. So there is quite a thing about divestment, probably at the moment, particularly around JCB and Caterpillar, and actually also HSBC, which is one of the banks that invests. And there have been a number of campaigns over the years. So that's boycott, divestment, and sanctions. Now, of course, sanctions is the thing that we remember from South Africa, but the argument in the South Africa days, in the 70s and 80s, is the same as it is with Israel now, which the sanctions need to be enacted by governments. They need to be, international sanctions, and that is what we are campaigning for. Now, I'm not saying that any country has come close to that yet, but on the other hand, they didn't in South Africa either until the very end. So I think, and of course Nelson Mandela is on record as saying, Archbishop Tutu is saying, no one is free until Palestine is free. So there is, narrative. So that's the argument about sanctions. So a lot of the day-to-day work that we do in PSC, in Tower, in East London, elsewhere, is around very detailed work around divestment and boycott.
So I appreciate you said you've written to Tower Hamlets, just to the council or to the individual councillors about the pension?
I've written to the individual council. We've written to the individual councillors. Now the situation in Tower Hamlets is a little bit difficult. I haven't had a response.
You don't say.
I know, but it actually is difficult. This is a completely different reason, which is that Tower Hamlets, along with a number of other boroughs, in fact, quite a lot of London boroughs, don't do their own investing in pension funds. What they do is they hand it all over to this dreadful sounding body called the London CIV, which is the London Collective Investment Vehicle. And it's some great big investment, I don't know, I don't really know how things work. And they make the investments, and they're not at all transparent. And they have exactly two councillors represented on the board of this thing, not from Tower Hamlets, one's from Wandsworth and one's from Ealing, I think. So getting through that is quite hard. I haven't had much willingness from the Tower Hamlets pension committee, which is largely made up of councillors, to do anything about that, but we're sort of chipping away at it. It's a bit of a long-term campaign. Some other places have had much bigger success because they're more directly involved.
I mean, do you think what happens in Tower Hamlets then, is that going to be replicated by other East London boroughs? Are we going to have problems there as well, or might some of them be a bit more receptive?
So, Newham is in the same situation as Tower Hamlets in the sense it doesn't do direct investment. So with Hackney, for example, you can on the PSC website there is a list of complicit companies. They've been named by the United Nations as complicit in the occupation, and you can point to these companies in Hackney and say, look, you are investing our pensions in our pension payments or our pensions in these countries. But that's not the case in Tower Hamlets or Newham. So Hackney PSC has made quite good inroads in that, and I believe that others around London have, but we're in a slightly more difficult position with that.
Oh dear. Well, we really ought to try to do something about that. I say to myself. So I can see that's yes. Okay, you're quite right. Sanctions is about so much more than where you buy your oranges.
Yes.
And that's the key to. So I suppose the other point then is sort of awareness. But let's take just a quick moment off from the campaign trail. And you mentioned that I said that I would ask you about COVID, and we all had the warning some months ago about how is COVID going to work in a country that has virtually no medical treatment, and never knows how long its buildings are going to keep standing. So, have you any reports from Gaza or the West Bank or East Jerusalem about how COVID's going, or even Israel?
I have. There was an article in the Lancet, the highly respected British, yes, medical journal thing, about COVID in Gaza. Now, COVID in Gaza has escalated massively just in the last 3 weeks. It's actually gone through the roof. But they were warning, I think, in September that the COVID in Gaza is the way that it's growing is a direct result of the ongoing blockade, and the fact that the blockade includes quite a lot of the blockade of Gaza is supposed to be to stop weapons getting to Hamas, but in fact it blockades drugs, it blockades medical equipment. It only has a very limited electricity supply. The blockade includes a number of different foodstuffs, and to that you add the devastation of the various bombing campaigns over the last 10 years in Gaza. So this 13-year blockade is a punishment for the people of Gaza. And of course, the result is that the COVID situation has completely spiraled out of control in Gaza. Somebody said, I think it was in the Guardian just a couple of days ago, that health system is at the end of its rope in Gaza. There are massive drug shortages, and of course there's extreme overcrowding. So that's the situation in Gaza, and I'm just trying to look at my little numbers here. Of course, I can't find them. In the West Bank, there have been 700 deaths in total in Palestine. That's excluding the refugee camps around in Lebanon and Syria. A very prominent politician of the Palestine Authority, Saeb Erekat, actually died last week of COVID. He had underlying all sorts of other stuff, but he was not very well liked on the ground. He actually sought medical treatment in Israel, which was viewed as pretty unpleasant because actually most Palestinians, when they need that kind of high quality medical treatment, they go to Jordan because they're allowed to go to Jordan. Anyway, he died, and he was a waste of space anyway, or worse than a waste of space actually. So the deaths are not enormous now. The numbers tested are not enormous, but on the other hand, there is very low capacity for testing, and I would expect those numbers the numbers of deaths to really escalate over the next weeks. I got these figures, such as they are, from a charity called Medical Aid for Palestinians, which we work with very closely. They're a really nice bunch of people, and they are basically trying to get ventilators into Gaza and into the West Bank. I think they said that yes, there are 87 intensive care beds in Palestine, that is in the West Bank and Gaza, for 2 million people.
Mm.
And I think 85 of them are occupied.
I think these are the statistics that are just so shocking, Sybil. And I think it's very hard for us, in the relative comfort of the UK and the West more generally, to think, you think of a blockade and you think, oh, well, that's just sort of like a bit of border control. But how a country can stop medicines, drugs coming through to the extent that the Israeli state does, and how other countries can just sit by and watch, I just cannot understand at all. And you just feel that the world has learnt nothing. We should have learnt lessons from the Holocaust, and that lessons should be to end the persecution of Jewish people, and it should also be not to replace it with the persecution of Arabs or Muslims or any other grouping, Rohingya, Uyghurs or whatever. It's absolutely incomprehensible. Yes. And it's one of the reasons why we're doing this programme, really, to keep the awareness
which
going.
Is a great job. You're doing a really good job. I mean, the thing that strikes me about the COVID situation in Palestine, well, there are two things. One of which is it's been hard enough here. It's been hard here, hasn't it? Yes. Really, really hard. Try and imagine doing that in Gaza or in the West Bank when you've got... And the other thing is that I think I said earlier, under the cover of COVID. So in October is the olive harvest month in Palestine. And normally lots and lots of international observers would go to help with the olive harvest. It's quite a nice thing to do. It's a nice time of year. Yes. It's nice and warm and blah, blah. But of course, there's nobody there now. Virtually nobody is going because there's no travel. And what that means is that the ferocity of the attacks, the settlers attacking olive growers and attacking olive trees and burning them down, particularly during the olive harvest, is much, much worse. And I mean, my Facebook feed is absolutely flooded with the most horrific videos. I mean, the good thing is that, the phone technology means that we can see these things, whereas 10 years ago we couldn't. But yeah.
Is there no other way we can... Well, I suppose the day of action is the way we respond. And we will finish off by talking about that shortly. But, I suppose one of the things we need to do is influence our parliament to do something. And of course, that's part of the week of action, isn't it? Do you want to talk a little bit about the virtual lobby next Tuesday?
I will, yes. So we're having a virtual lobby of Parliament. This is, I think, we think it's the first ever virtual lobby of Parliament, because PSC have a lobby every November. And what we're doing is we are emailing our MPs and trying to persuade them to create a Zoom call with their concerned constituents. And Rushnara Ali has agreed to do that, which is fantastic. And we're actually meeting her not next Wednesday, but actually next Thursday, which suits her better. And I don't know how many of us there'll be on the call, but Rushnara is generally pretty positive about Palestine. She's been to Palestine several times. She speaks up about it in Parliament. And so whatever difference we might have with her, and she normally does come and meet us in Parliament when we do the lobby day. So that's good. Now, the last time I looked, nobody had asked Apsana for a meeting. Now, that may well have changed in the last few days. So I don't quite know. I'm one of Rushnara's constituents, so I don't actually know what's happening with Apsana. I know that at least one of the new MPs, Lynn Brown, has agreed with, to meet with some constituents, and the other guy, Stephen Timms, I don't know if he has yet. I haven't heard.
Stephen, if you're listening, respond to the PSC. Offer to contact them. Offer to meet your constituents. Speak up about Palestine. I canvassed for you, Stephen Timms, many years ago. Only once, but I did go out and canvass for you. Now it's payback time, and things like that. I suspect. I mean, I will echo what you're saying about Rushnara, in that she has not only spoken out against oppression of the Palestinians, but actually, occasionally has actually really gone out of her way to speak up, and I think that is very, very welcome on Rushnara's part. And I suspect probably people don't want to lobby Apsana because they take her for granted.
Well, I think that is part of the problem, because Apsana did an online Zoom meeting, public meeting for us in June, and she's never been to Palestine, but she really did her homework. She was absolutely brilliant, and I think when we're able to travel again, I'm sure she'll come.
But it's important, isn't it, that even if your MP is very supportive of the Palestinian cause, you need to give them the I was going to say ammunition, but the fodder, let's say, to continue making the case, because you can't stand up in Parliament and say Palestine is really important. None of my constituents has contacted me. You want to stand up and say I was deluged by constituents who are concerned. So again, all you people out there. If you are Apsana's constituent, then go onto the East London News website, look up our article, and there you will see a link direct to register yourself as wanting to speak to your MP. I'm sure there are plenty of other links on Palestinian Solidarity Campaign pages as well, but that's just a small plug for East London News as well. So we can work together on that one.
Good. Thanks for doing that.
So you're very welcome.
Another small thing, and this is only just beginning, is that there are things called early day motions, which are sort of little motions about non-central things. There are 2 on Palestine at the moment, which we will be asking Apsana and Rushnara to sign, and I suspect they probably both will actually. They've only been launched in the last few days. They're actually been launched by a Scottish Nationalist MP, yes,
well, they're cross-party things, EDMs, aren't they? Do let us have the details, and we'll publicise those as well. In East London News. So good. So there's this lobbying of MPs. That's one thing we're doing to get some real change from our policy makers, our leaders. That's very good. But we're also doing a bit of general public awareness, aren't we, in this week of action? So tell us about that, Sybil.
Well, there are 2 things actually. One of which I'm not really at all involved in, due to the fact that I'm not 19 anymore. The Student Day of Action tomorrow. Which is involving students around the country doing various stunts, and I don't know what, actually, to be honest. But the main day of action is actually on Saturday, and PSC branches are being asked to, or are organising, obviously highly socially distanced protests with Palestinian flags and petitions and information, and we have this this attractive postcard which has now got a QR code on it, so you can then go straight onto the website, and a little bit of factual information. So we will be doing that. We will have a stall, and we'll be selling badges and a few other things, a few kefirs and stuff like that. So we're doing 2. One is in Whitechapel, outside the Ideas store in the market, because we know that's a nice busy place and a nice busy time on a Saturday. And the second one is in Newham, outside Stratford. It's the one that we said outside McDonald's. And the reason we said outside McDonald's is because we wanted to make sure people got to the right end of the market, the right end of the right market. And unfortunately, you identify that with, I mean, if you think of a better way of identifying it, do let me know. But you know what I mean, don't you?
Yes, I certainly do. Perhaps I should explain to our listeners that I was minding my own business, typing away some article or other, when this alert flashed over my screen saying, "Let's all meet at McDonald's." And I thought, I don't know anybody who would actually organise a party during lockdown in McDonald's. And then I found out it was a protest, so that was okay. I was reassured and reminded to let everybody else know. So that's good. So outside the old, the existing McDonald's in the old traditional
Stratford, good old Stratford
shopping centre, where you could go to get a bit of cheap stuff without being ripped off. Yeah. Anyway, let's not have a rant about that. And then in the morning at Whitechapel. So if you're going to either of those 2 places, stop by, look out for the stall, stop by, say hello, pick up a postcard, and generally check in with PSC. That would be
and of course the other thing we're going to be doing is handing out our contact card. I don't know if I showed you this last time. This is a drawing of a key. So the symbol of the right of return. This drawing was done by Tim Sanders, who's a local artist, when he was in Palestine 3 or 4 years ago. And it's our contact card, and it's got all the different ways of contacting us, our email. We have a big email list. Lots of people get told about our stuff. We've got a Facebook, we've got a Twitter, we've now got an Instagram, which of course I don't really know how to use, but yeah. So
stop putting yourself down, Sybil. You're doing the stuff. That's fine. Okay, so this is what we want you to do, dear viewer. We want you to be in touch with the Palestine Solidarity Campaign. You're called the East London Palestine Solidarity Campaign. And do you still keep that Twin Janine phrase in your time? Yes,
we do. Because there wasn't really anything in Newham. We just decided we should just, I mean, in theory, we go to a lot of other boroughs, but actually Newham is our hamlets.
And the other East London boroughs, Redbridge, Barking and Dagenham, do they have their own local campaigns?
They don't, but they have members. So we're called East London, which means that we're basically Tower Hamlets, Newham, Redbridge, Barking, Dagenham. But there's another group in Waltham Forest and Redbridge, and then there's another group in Hackney, and then all over London. But not every borough has its own one.
Well, Stratford is a good place to get to. So if you've got a bit of time and there's nothing going on in your borough, then head down there and help out. Keep in touch, join up. I know PSC is calling for people to join up or renew their membership so this campaigning can continue. And
I think the other thing to say is that obviously not everybody feels comfortable going out at the moment. But what we're aiming to do is to flood social media with pictures of campaigners on the streets or even in their living rooms, waving Palestinian flags and showing solidarity, using exactly those three slogans that you had up earlier: stop annexation, end apartheid, and sanctions now. So those are the slogans that we're using. So I'm making placards tomorrow.
Good. And I know you also said something that, I'm not going anywhere like as far as Whitechapel at the moment, seeing as we're locked down, and I'm been locked up to Shield again, which was amazing. I think it was on the 11th of November. I think I got a letter dated the 4th of November saying, you should have been staying indoors for the last 9 days or something like that. So there we go. Fortunately, I'm doing it now a bit more. Anyway, so I did notice as well that you were saying, if you've got a Palestinian flag, take it out with you on Saturday if you're going out for a walk or a bike ride or something like that, so that people can see those colours and that flag pattern around the place. So that's what's coming up across East London, trying to... it's not only a humanitarian thing, is it, Sybil? It's a sort of political thing that your taxes, dear viewer, are being used, your name is being used to justify the most terrible oppression of people who have been deprived of the right to fight back themselves, really, because they can't compete and really need a bit of activity from you. So we do encourage you to get active. Right, I think we're going to have to move to wrapping up now, Sybil. I think, again, it's been an excellent programme. I think you put the facts across extremely well. Is there anything else you'd like to say? Anything that you haven't managed to get in yet?
If my notes are better, I might be able to answer that question. But
well, you'll have to come back or put it in in the next press release.
No, thank you.
Yes,
really
keep
good.
coming back, and so we'll move to a close on the old Palestine thing. We look forward tomorrow to Mr. Sunak's spending review, and if the rumours are to be believed, the public sector pay freeze is due. That'll give us another worry to face. Something else to campaign on. And I think the petitions are already doing the rounds on that now. I think there's one on the actual House of Commons site, calling on people to sign a petition against the public sector pay freeze. I'm just not clicking up at this. Examples of that. Oh yes, go on the petition.parliament.uk, and the petition is called "Give Government Workers a Fair Pay Rise," and the aim is to get 100,000 signatures so that Parliament has to discuss it. So give that a look as well. But don't forget the Palestinians, come out on Saturday and keep supporting the East London PSC. Okay? Lovely. Right.
Thank you.
You're very
Thanks,
welcome,
Jen.
Sybil. We'll see you again in the new year, maybe. And with that, so get out and get active, dear viewer. And we'll see you again. I'll tell you now, we've got a very exciting show lined up next Tuesday when we're really going to key in to give you just a little teaser. We're going to have a real good look at some Islamophobia that's going on with a very special guest. So keep an eye out for that. We'll see you next Tuesday. But for now, good night.